right, and we are here again, and we are back again. As always, I'm Matt.
I'm Drew.
And this is the Back Again podcast. This is the only review show that takes a sequel from the past and finds out if in fact it is worth going back again. We are almost done with this action movie sequel list, and today we are doing a personal favorite of mine, the follow-up to the 2002 Transporter, and we are doing Transporter 2.
Yeah.
I'm looking for a transporter.
I'm listening.
It was supposed to be an easy assignment.
Hey! What's the first rule when entering a man's car? Good. This was a favor. I don't usually do this sort of a job.
I thought you were a professional driver.
A different kind of driving.
Transporter 2 comes out in 2005. Returning to direct is one of the two, Louis Leterrier. It's starring, and sorry if I get any names incorrect, Jason Statham, Alessandro Gassman, Amber Valletta, Kate Nada, Matthew Modine, Jason Fleming, Keith David, and Francois Berliand, French name. Sorry, I don't know. So now here's the part where I usually read a description of what the movie's about, but this plot's pretty interesting. So what I want to do is I'm going to read you one description of the breakdown, then I'm going to give you my description of the breakdown, all right? So here's the first one. Mercenary Frank Martin has accepted a job that seems easy enough as chauffeur and bodyguard to young Jack, son of crusading politician Jefferson Billings. The problem is that Billings is crusading against an international drug cartel. They retaliate by kidnapping Jack and infecting him with a deadly and highly contagious virus. Responsible for the boy, Frank must reclaim him and then find the antidote before scores of innocents are stricken. That's one of the breakdowns right there. All right, here's the second one. Transporter 2 picks up a couple years after the first film, where Frank Martin, now taking a break from his crime life, accepts a job as a personal driver for a politician's son. Things go sideways when the cartel attempt to kidnap and infect the boy in hopes of spreading a disease throughout his family and eventually to the House of Representatives. With the clock ticking down, Frank must rescue the boy, stop the bad guy, find the antidote, and save the government? So out of those
Coming
two,
this fall.
which one do you like better out of those two?
I like the second one, but the first one does connect the politician to the crime, the antagonist, more directly. Because that's kind of the weakest part of the movie is the connection. You know, we've got to get these bad guys connected to Frank somehow. How do we do it? Well, we'll do all these convoluted plot points, and then it's entertaining, but it's like, Jesus, how do they do this?
Yeah, the first one is from Google, and the second one is the one that I wrote to kind of try to explain it. And you're right, it's interesting reading how they're describing this movie because there's a lot of factors. This is like, we always say that plots are kind of convoluted on the sequel podcast. I wouldn't say this plot is convoluted. I would just say there's a lot of it. There's a lot of things like going on that you just don't happen to know beforehand.
It transports you around, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about this Transporter kind of franchise. And I think a good place to start is to kind of go back to the plot because, you know, the first movie Transporter that comes out in 2002, it's got a fairly simple plot. We meet a guy, he's a transporter, and then something goes wrong on one of his transports that leads to, like, you know, a wacky series of events. But at the end of the movie, he resets and he goes back to being a transporter.
But what is a transporter, Matt?
A transporter is just somebody who does crime, who just transports the crimes or transports the goods to other criminals and stuff like that, right? He's a criminal transporter.
Yeah, he's a car for hire.
That's how we know him, right? In the second one, he's still a criminal transporter, but this movie isn't about him being a transporter. What this movie is kind of like right guy at the wrong time. Because they are essentially hiring a chauffeur. The bad guys then attack the boy and the chauffeur, but they don't know that this chauffeur, who's really only filling in, Frank's only filling in for a friend. He explains that like to the wife, like, oh, I'm only doing this for a month and then I'm going to go back to my life or whatever. But that contributes to the plot because they don't know that this guy's like a badass. So they go to steal the boy, and that's where I say right guy, wrong time. So the second movie's not really about being a transporter as much as it is taking the transporter, putting him in a different situation, and then seeing how it plays out.
I agree with that. What I would say is the first movie should have just been called The Transport because it's all about the job. You set up what his job is, and then how can we make this the most interesting example of this? And they do a pretty good job. This should actually be called The Transport 2, The Transporter. Because what you're doing here is you're actually applying the skills and talents learned, as one will learn, doing a transport type of job, but connecting them more directly to Frank Martin and how he chooses to attribute those in his real life. Because when he's doing this chauffeur thing, it's kind of like his real life. He's not really doing the act of the crime driver anymore. We saw that all in the first one.
I'll tell you what, it would have been cool if they gave this movie a different title, but they kept it canon that he's the transporter again in this movie. Because the movie's not about transporting anything. It's about, like, they should have called this movie, like, The Chauffeur.
That's the thing I'm saying, though, is he's still using all of the, because it ends up getting, the cartel involved. So then he ends up attributing all of the skills he learned as a transporter into this chauffeuring job.
Yeah, and it feels like a missed opportunity because there's never a moment in Transporter 2 where the bad guys say, like, who the heck is this guy? The chauffeur? Like, you would expect the bad guys to really kind of be hit sideways by the fact that Frank Martin is, like, so equipped.
They're kind of expecting it.
Yeah, they're really not surprised by it. They kind of just keep their cool. Like, I think about that scene at the hospital where they take out everyone, and then when he kind of interjects and tries to stop the injection with the needle, then they're just fighting him, but they're not, like, surprised at all that they're fighting the driver. And even, like, the bad guy, there's never a scene where he's like, what happened? The driver? But he's just a driver.
The other thing is he looks intimidating. So when someone like Jason Statham fights well, your first instinct isn't really to be surprised. Like, oh, wow, you fight well? Yeah. It's to be like, oh, of course this guy fights well. Look at him. He's bald. He probably doesn't have much else going on.
So yeah, so outside of that, I don't really have any problems with the plot. The plot's really kind of goofy and silly with this whole, the cartel is trying to affect a politician so he can get the whole, a whole room full of, like, senators and reporters all sick and stuff. It feels kind of out of left field.
You can judge a movie's seriousness by the saturation. If it's super saturated like this, it's not serious. If it looks like The Road, then it's super serious.
Yeah, we just saw something with this with Bad Boys where the first one kind of has one look to it and then the second one looks way more kind of like early 2000s and it's way more saturated. Like this is kind of the same deal with the Transporter one because the first Transporter, it's not set in America. I don't remember absolutely where they are, but it's got more of a kind of beige color tone and it's more kind of grounded. Whereas in this one, like you said, it's way more colorful. It's way more vibrant.
Yeah, there you go. I think it plays better with less over-the-top action. Like, you can't really have the vibrant and the over-the-top action because then it's almost like too much. This, you have a little bit more subtle action, air quotes, but it's the saturation kind of helps make it pop a bit more.
And you don't need over-the-top action when you have a lead that is an action guy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the good thing about this Transporter franchise is that Jason Statham, for the most part, is doing all his own stunts. And he's a great fighter. He's great on camera. I wish that there was a little bit more steady cam in the franchise because I want to see more of it. But for the most part, he's what's entertaining.
I personally had, the color palette was one thing. I had a little bit of difficulty distinguishing the action from the first one. I felt like they were both pretty decent. They both had a decent amount that they were contributing. It wasn't crazy cutting like Bad Boys, but it also wasn't like flawless choreography like The Raid. It was a very nice middle ground where you could tell that there were enough people who cared enough, and it wasn't so much we're gonna put everything we have into this, but it also wasn't so much keep cutting, shake the camera more, it'll make it seem more intense. They knew what they were doing if they also weren't the most talented people in the world.
I think the second one has more fight scenes and action because the first one's about transporting, right? So you'll have an opening, car chase scene, which is what they do in the first one, but then it takes a while to get some more action going because you have to have the plot kick in at some point. With the second one, they don't open on an action scene. Well, they do. They open on him fighting in the garage again. But the plot kicks in a lot faster because we're not waiting to reveal something that involved with the transportation of something. We're just dealing with like a situation. So bad guys are going to pop up here at the doctor's appointment. But I mean, this sequel has more fighting in it. It has more action, especially when you consider that whole final act when he's like, raiding to go get the boy back or to go get the antidote or something like that.
I think it has more to do with the plot being more centralized in the first one. That's kind of why the action is structured the way it is, because we've got to get a big piece to kick us off in the beginning so that people will sit through the exposition we have to get through, and then we can bring the action back around at the end of Act 2 and into Act 3. In this one, the plot is kind of takes a back seat. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but you can tell that it wasn't necessarily what they were most focused on. So it's kind of structured to accommodate a more high-octane action movie, where it's like we can spend a little bit bit time at the beginning, but then it's essentially nonstop action as soon as Act 2 starts.
I think the sets in which Jason Statham fights, they make more sense in the first one because they're connected to the plot. Like, when he breaks into the mansion, he kicks the door in after like a ding dong.
Yeah.
And then when he's also fighting on like the crates, like the storage crates and stuff like that, or even on the truck. But I actually like the set pieces more in the second one, because they're just like, they're just super fun set pieces for him to fight in.
And they're unique. They don't fall into the tropes of this is what they do in action movies, so we should do it too. It's like, what's something not necessarily related to the plot, but what's something different that we can kind of have an excuse for them to go to.
Well, plus this whole final act where he's fighting all these guys, I was bringing this up when we were watching it, feels very like Jackie Chan inspired, because there's a point where he's fighting with a water hose. He's wrapping everybody in it, and then he turns on the water, then they all kind of get sucked back like a Sam Raimi movie and everything.
I think the weakest fight between the two is the first fight in the second one, and then everything else in the second one is more of a callback, or it's something with a little bit more of a clever twist. And then on top of that, it's a little bit bigger in a way that doesn't detract from the character or the plot for all its faults. So I do think that even though the second one has the worst fight in it at the beginning, I think it does have a lot more better fights.
That opening fight in the second movie, it kind of tells you what this movie is going to be, because the opening of the first movie opens up on driving. It shows him being a transporter. So with the second one, when they open up on a fight scene, they're kind of almost like subconsciously telling you, like, this isn't going to be a transporter movie. This is going to be about a driver who knows how to fight. So they're going to try to get him out of his car. He's going to fight him. Then he's going to go back to his car and go back to work.
My immediate reaction was to say I don't think that this does a good job of, that opening scene does a good job of representing the sequel as a whole, because it seemed redundant in the way that it was portraying the car, the garage, Jason Statham, but it's still doing all that stuff that it did in the first movie that was about transporting. So it made me think that this was just going to be full of cliche like copy, like almost like an Escape from LA. But then they do a great job of deviating. They make it more about the fighting, they make it less about the transporting, which you're okay with because Jason Statham is an interesting character and a good actor. So yeah, aside from the first few, I think the first few minutes are definitely the weakest link of this movie. But everything else, I think we agree, kind of is pretty on point.
Well, you brought up a good point with the sequels having these Escape from LA tendencies, and there is one moment in this movie where they put the bomb on the bottom of his car, and then they take the boy and they tell him to drive away, and then the bad guy's like, wait till he gets some distance and then blow up the car. And his his solution for this is he's gonna launch the car in the air where there's what do you want to say? That's like a crane, right? It's in a crane's dangling, and then he flips the car upside down, and the crane successfully takes the bomb off the car. And then they kind of just blow past that, and they never really draw any attention to it. It's not like he goes, all right, or anything like that.
That was Escape from LA levels of lame, but at least it wasn't redundant. It wasn't something that they were calling back to in the first one. It was stupid, but at least it was new.
It was new, but it was also kind of I like the fact that they didn't draw too much attention to it, that they kind of just got over it. But it feels kind of misplaced because everything else is ridiculous in the movie, but it's still grounded in some kind of ridiculousness. That's the one thing that still kind of stuck out as did you need this?
We could actually probably make a term for this. We'll call it the shark punch.
Yeah, the shark punch. It's the wave, riding the wave, like Escape from LA.
Yeah, exactly. It's we have to pick one of them, but it's why there's always that one instance of something that's just stupidly ridiculous.
And then the other thing that we're forgetting about that's also a really kind of Escape from LA moment is when he's driving away with the girlfriend of the bad guy, who's also his number one henchman or something like that. And they're in the parking garage and they're zipping around, and then out of nowhere he just kind of jumps. It's not like he even revs up into it or says hang on. They're just kind of driving, and then out of nowhere he just jumps buildings.
Well, he jumps a wall, which is impossible.
Yeah, he goes through a wall and then he lands in the parking garage, and then he just kind of slides and then breaks it right before they get to the edge.
Well, it's not even a parking garage; it's a partially constructed building.
Yeah, it's just the fact that it's with this taking off the bomb off the car and then with the jumping of the buildings, they kind of just do it. They don't really
think about it.
Yeah, they don't really think about it or set it up. They kind of just do it, and then we kind of move on after the fact. And then obviously at the end of that parking garage scene, there's a helicopter, and she shoots it out of the sky with the worst CGI. So there's just these 3 little moments where it's that's kind of dumb. You didn't need that, but you forget about it because there's other moments that are obviously really fun.
Yeah, they at least have the decency to blow past it. If they're going to do something ridiculous, they at least know that, like, we have to get past this. We can't let the audience think about it, because if they do, it's not going to make any rational sense. So we have to, like, get past it. And like, that's where you can say the pacing succeeds.
And I get why they do it, because at the end of the day, what they're presenting this character, Frank Martin, as, if I break it down to one word, it would be efficient or clever, right? He adapts in situations. He always finds ways out of it. And he doesn't get phased emotionally. He's always very, like, kind of focused. Outside of that, just to kind of go back and talk about the budget and the box office for both of these movies. So the first Transporter comes out in 2002. It's got 2 directors. One of them returns back for the second one. But it's got a budget of 21 million, and then it's got a box office of 43.9 million. And the only reason why this movie, I believe, gets made is because Luc Besson is one of the screenwriters on it, right?
Yeah.
They have a pretty good return on it. Now, with the second one that comes out in 2005, it's got a budget of 32 million, so a little bit more, and then it's got a box office of 89.1 million. So this sequel is actually more successful financially. And then just to go into the Rotten Tomatoes scores real quick, the first one has a 54% on Rotten Tomatoes, and Transporter 2 has a 52% on Rotten Tomatoes.
That's pretty accurate, I'd say.
They're kind of in the same boat. I mean, obviously, I think I like the story more from the first one, but I think I like the second one just a little bit more.
I would say, honestly, yeah.
But it's not like the story for either of them are that, like, entertaining.
Yeah, you watch a movie like this for the action and the character, and I think 2 has better action and better character.
Yeah. Well, there's 2 things you should know about Frank Martin. Women want to sleep with him, and he's got a conscience.
I was going to say, women want to sleep with him, but he doesn't want to sleep with women.
He doesn't want to. He's always like, come on.
He's the most reluctant lay I've ever seen.
And then even the main bad girl, who's like the number 1 or the number 2 to the main bad guy.
And she doesn't necessarily want to sleep with him.
Yeah.
She just uses sex as a psychological weapon.
But she also says, like, if I was in a different world, or like we were in a different place, like you and me would have a real good time. And I just think it's like this subconscious thing that, like, whenever you have like an action lead, it's like, oh, and by the way, everybody also wants to fuck him. Mm-hmm. And let's just subtly put that out there.
You're quite a guy. Another time, another place. You and me, baby. The pleasure we could have.
Is there anything that we really didn't like about the movie that took us out of the movie? Because I think in general, this was an easier franchise to watch than maybe, like, we just
any of the last 5.
Yeah, any of the last. We just did Lara Croft, and Lara Croft there was good parts with that, but this is like very, I don't know, it's more focused on what it's trying to do.
Yeah, like none of these other sequels really felt complete. They always felt like they had one thing that wasn't what they should have been focusing on necessarily, and were just like focusing way too hard on it. This one, actually, they were focusing on multiple things. They left some things out, and it's very obvious, but they didn't need those. They knew their strengths, and they played to them. And more importantly than that, they had multiple ones. They weren't just leaning into one angle.
Yeah. Some things that every sequel we've done so far does is callbacks to the first one. So with this one big callback is going to be, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name again, but he basically plays Inspector Tarconi. Mm-hmm. He's the French guy.
Yeah. The one that you can like almost never understand.
You can never, he's always, every scene he's in, he's just like mumbling something.
Well, that's the thing, is like his accent is super strong, and it feels like the audio on his scenes are just like off for some reason, like they were in bad locations or something.
And he's a good performer. Like, I actually enjoy him. I think he's funny and stuff. I just can't understand what he's saying.
Yeah, he was a lot better in the second one too.
Yeah, he had more stuff to kind of do in the second
one. Well, yeah, they
one.
gave him a little like side arc, which was fun.
Well, that's one of the callbacks, right? They bring him back. He says that he's just here visiting, like on vacation or going to check him. Another callback that they do within that is that, like, he's at his house and he's cooking those, like, what do you want to call those, French bread, like, kind of biscuits that he's making. That
I thought they were crepes, but I might be wrong.
No, they're not crepes.
Okay.
He's making those in his kitchen. That's the stuff that the girl that he rescues in the first one's making in his kitchen. Then obviously when the cops show up at the house, he gives the same response that she gave, which is, I'm the cook. Another callback is the 3 rules. Frank Martin has 3 rules, and then he's saying those in the first one in the opening scene, and then when the little kid's in his car in the second movie, he says the 3 rules again, but he just like alters them.
Well, that's what I like about this movie, is there weren't a lot of them. It wasn't just like, oh, you could watch this on your own. It's like it stands on its own.
Yeah. And that's the point I was trying to make, which is every movie has callbacks. This movie has them too. There's just not that many of them, like you were saying. And then when you do see them, they're kind of like refreshing.
Well, they're
kinda
more like
cute.
they're cute.
They're worked in more cleverly instead of on the nose.
Yeah, they're not major plot points. There's not a lot hinging on them. They're just light moments that are there for the audience to enjoy, not something that the audience has to like think about, where it's almost like, was that in the first one?
Well, keep in mind too, it's not like you have to like reinvent the wheel to write an action movie. It's just you have to be competent and not too ridiculous or not be too lazy with it. And I think what this Transporter franchise does is it takes itself just seriously enough to where you can like easily watch it and not have to like overthink it. There's stuff that's silly, but you kind of get everything out of it, you know?
I'm trying to think of a good way to word that. It doesn't take itself seriously, but it knows that it should.
I'll give you an example. Like there's a moment where Frank needs to like get security footage from the doctor's office.
Oh
and
my
he's
God.
got to share it with, you know where I'm going with this.
I know where you're
He's
going
got to
with
share it with
this.
the inspector. And what he does is he finds him like an old iPod that's on a table, and he plugs the iPod in with a USB, and then he plugs it in the wall. He's able to get security footage then from the monitor onto an iPod. And then when he gets back into a car, he's going to share the footage from his iPod into his car that's then going to be sent to a police computer that then the inspector can hack into and then cross-reference it with documents and pictures that are in the police database of this guy that they're looking for.
Now, you said an old iPod. I'll correct you. That is state-of-the-art technology back then.
Oh, yeah.
They did not know what iPods were capable of back in whatever year this was, 2004, 2005. So when they were doing that, it was very believable.
So when you're watching it, it's very like...
When you're watching it nowadays.
Yeah, okay, I'll play devil's advocate. So when you're just watching it in general, you're like, okay, technology. When you're watching it nowadays, like, that's an iPod.
Yeah.
And then there's another thing that kind of always bothered me, and I think it just has to do with the editing of it. But when we're in our final battle with Blondie, and she's in her, you know, lingerie, and she's got her double machine guns, and she's fighting Frank, and she's zipping around on, I don't know, what do you want to call those beads? Like wire beads or something like that. She's wrapping her arms around and flying around the room and kicking them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a moment where he grabs her and then throws her into a wall, and then we reveal out of nowhere that there's this like spiked wall that almost looks like an art design, like something from Knives Out.
I think it was a wine rack, wasn't it?
Sure, maybe it's a wine rack.
But yeah, that's the thing is like, and this is the reveal. This is the first time we see it.
First time we see it. And it always bothered me because it's like you would expect somewhere in the fight that she would kick Frank. Frank would almost fall into it. That would give him the signal that that's there. And then he would throw her into it. But it kind of came out of nowhere. And for a movie that has a lot of
like good writing in it, or just like even good like setup when it comes to fighting and plot points.
Yeah, setup, I think. For a movie that does that kind of setup and payoff within this franchise, it felt very like, oh, did they forget to...
It felt like a scene was deleted or a sequence of the fight was like rewritten.
Yeah, cut, or I think it was just probably cut down for time.
Yeah.
Right? Because
But this movie's already so tight.
Well, both these movies have very short runtimes. Like the first one, I believe, is just under or just over an hour 30, and then the second one is just under an hour 30. So these are... You know, these are really tight, kind of by the books action movies.
Not really by the books, but just like tight and good.
And to be honest, I think there's more noticeable kind of, you know, gimmicky things in the second one than there are in the first one, because the first one's just more about like the actual plot, right? Like it gets kind of confusing, and I don't want to talk too much about the first one, but like when we get into the whole, are these bad guys actually shipping human beings like across like
the
sea,
mystery,
and like how the daughter plays into that. Like when we got into the third act of that movie, it got a little confusing, and I got kind of taken out of it because I was like, I don't really care about what the bad guys are doing. What's great about this movie is that the bad guy is really kind of comical and he's really kind of generic. So that way we just get to see Frank do more stuff and him kind of discover it. And I think this is actually a good point just to briefly talk about the bad guy. What do you think of this bad guy in the second one?
Well, that's the thing is he was underdeveloped, but it was to the movie's benefit because we had more time with Frank and we had more time with the henchman, which the henchman is more interesting because he's the one that's actually interfacing, or I'm sorry, she's the one who's actually interfacing with the protagonist. She's the one who has the more direct conflict with the protagonist, and we had just watched The Losers, I think for the second time each, and that kind of is in the same ballpark where the main henchman is more interesting than the antagonist because he's interacting more with the heroes and he has past history with one of the heroes. The bad guy in Losers, I don't want to talk too much about it, but he was just crazy. And it's kind of the same thing with this, where the bad guy is just crazy because we need a stand-in to be the main villain, and then we can focus on making the main henchman Statham and Jason Statham more interesting.
The clever thing I do like that he does is when he puts all the antidote in his body. That way Frank can't kill him. I think that is a cliche thing I've seen before, but for the sake of this movie, I actually do like that because he's like, you want the antidote? I am the antidote. And it's like, what a great line. And even like that whole fight, like how he gets him back, like then they go in a plane and then you get some really bad plane CGI exterior, but from the inside, you know, they're doing a pretty good job with like flipping the set around and having some what appears to be zero gravity kind of fighting going
having some fun with it.
You know, he just like knocks him out, puts him in like a life preserver and then takes him to the surface. We never really get to see them get the antidote out of him. I would have liked to see that scene where he's in the hospital bed, wakes up with handcuffs, and he's like, adios mio, and like all the antidotes getting sucked out of him. And then it would have been maybe cool if after the antidote's out of him, then Frank kills him. But Frank's not really a killer.
Or he always tries not to kill if he can avoid it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Take a good look, Frank Martin. I'm a cure for what ails you. I'm the only cure for what ails you. I am the antidote. Well, nice try. I'm impressed. Didn't give you enough credit. Took more than a driver to figure this out.
I haven't figured it all out yet.
So as always on this podcast, we ask 3 questions that lead to a final vote of is it worth going back again? And the first question is, does it work as a sequel? And I'll start off and I'll make it pretty quick. Surprisingly enough, I do not think this works as a sequel. And the reason why is because it does not continue the character and the lore of the world, which is transporting. Now, this doesn't reflect how I feel about the movie, if I think it's good or bad, but if we're talking about the rules of does it work as a sequel, and what we want is a bigger world, a continuation of the character, and new challenges. It gives Frank new challenges, 100%, don't get me wrong, and I actually like the challenges that he faces, but in regards to, if you watch the first Transporter, and then you watch this, you'd be like, he doesn't even transport anything in that second one. He does variations of transporting. He transports a kid to school. He transports an antidote back to the kid. He transports a bomb to a crane that gets the bomb off of his car. But he's not actually transporting anything. So it's going to be a harsh, it's going to be an X, but I'm not happy about it. But just for the sake of this podcast, I don't actually think it works as a sequel.
It's going to get a check from me. Because I'm not going to be quite as literal as you.
Yeah.
Yes, it does not work in making the transporting world bigger. But like I said, I think it does develop the character because he's still using skills that he learned from transporting. It might be kind of vague depending on if you're watching the sequel alone without watching the first one. But I think the character is consistent, the character grows, and the character is in a new and interesting circumstance. So those are... I think those factor into making it interesting and, you know, engaging, but also I think they contribute into making it a competent sequel.
I agree with all that. It just has nothing to do with transporting.
I know, but I am more okay with it because of the character. I agree with the plot has nothing to do with transporting or has very little to do with transporting, but the character sells it for me.
So it sounds like it's going to get a quick check and an X. So the second question is going to be, is it enjoyable / entertaining? And if I could just like save like, you know, what I did on the first one, like, yes, I think this is enjoyable / entertaining. I gave it an X on the first one just to be kind of like, you know, respectful to the rules of the podcast. But yeah, this is enjoyable / entertaining. It came out in 2005. It's got Jason Statham. He's gonna like, you know, rip his shirt a couple times. He's gonna fight some bad guys, and he's gonna, you know, he doesn't really have like a lot of one-liners, but they give all the one-liners to the female henchman.
She had 3 one-liners back to back in like the first 20 minutes.
Yeah. You asked at a certain point, are all her lines of dialogue one-liners?
And it was literally, she had 2, and I was like, is that all that they wrote for her? And then she delivered a third one, and I was like, I guess I'm right.
And I'll tell you what, usually we laugh or we roll our eyes at these one-liners. I kind of liked all her one-liners.
Well, that's the thing. It's like it's not camp, but it's like you have to be aware. You have to like be aiming for something, and you can be aiming for ridiculous and pull it off. I think it all comes down to pulling it off.
Yeah.
This movie pulls it off because it takes the things it needs to take seriously. It tries where it needs to try insofar as functioning as like a competent movie. And then you can have your hammy villain. You can have your henchman delivering 3 one-liners back to back to back. You can have Jason Statham being the quintessential quiet, stoic archetype because there's other things that are propping up those what you would call just kind of simple or basic story elements.
Yeah.
It's gonna get a quick check for me. Yeah, this was definitely super entertaining. I love movies like this. I didn't love this movie, but I liked it a lot. The action was great. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't too shaky. It wasn't too intricate. It wasn't too hot. It wasn't too cold. The character was well written. It's very interesting because you could go in and you could look at all these little minute things that you, like a screenwriter or a director, might not think is important, but that they took seriously when they were doing this, and that helped elevate it. I don't want to do that right now because we're already toward the end of this, but there's just so much, I think the word is care, that we don't see in a lot of these other sequels that goes into this movie that really helps prop it up despite what would be perceived as shortcomings.
Yeah, I think we can both agree that, that's 2 checks. This is enjoyable / entertaining. So the last question is, does it need to exist? And you can start off this one.
I think I might give it an X for this one, going based off of the rules not the rules, but the kind of criteria that you established, or that you and Louis have kind of been establishing. I like that it exists, and I want it to exist because I think it's better than the first one, and it does expand on the character, which I think is honestly more important, probably like 80 to 90% of the time. But insofar as telling a story that's set in this transporter universe, showing us what this is like, essentially what they would have done if this was written nowadays is they would do something like John Wick, where they focus 100% on the sequel, on the world. Maybe not 100%, but focus much more on the world, what other drivers look like, what other contractors might look like. And in this one, they just go, this is just going to be a Jason Statham movie, and he's just going to be doing something that is interesting, not something related to his job. And like I said, I can't give this movie a check when I say that I feel like the title should be different, because this isn't about transporting, it's about the transporter. So I feel like that on its own is merit enough to give this an X.
Well, we kind of flip-flop, because that same stuff that you're applying to this X, you're putting in this category. I'm putting that into the first category.
Exactly.
Because to me, does it work as a sequel? Like, that's what it's about. It's about the sequel. Now, if you're asking me, does it need to exist? That's why I said in the first question, like, I think this movie needs to exist. I just don't think it works as a sequel.
Okay.
So I'm going to give it a check then. And I'm going to say, yeah, I do think it needs to exist, because it is a good example of how you can keep your character, put him in a new situation, but still leave some remnants of who he was in the first one, or who she was in the first one. So I like it because it's like a Monday morning, or it's like a Sunday morning cartoon special where we just get to see our character put himself into another situation. I don't think it plays as a sequel. And in regards to the title of the movie, because you just said, like, I can't give it a check if I want a different title. I can still give it a check, even though it has the same title, but that reason is why I'll give it an X in the first one.
Yeah.
Because it's called Transporter, so therefore it doesn't work as a sequel. But it does, I think it needs to exist, because this is like, this is good action stuff right here. This is cliche, it's cheesy, but we're in Miami. We got better fight scenes, and it's Jason Statham, man.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is, we agree on what the problem is, but we disagree on
where to put that problem,
or what that problem means.
So if you're doing that math at home, that's going to be 4 checks and 2 X's. So it is going to get 1 giant check for worth going back again. And yeah, I'm personally a fan of this franchise. I think that you have gained some positives from watching it for the first time. And I would also recommend, and hopefully in the future, when we are, doing more sequels or more continuations of franchises, we get to do Transporter 3. But I would recommend to people, if you're looking for a nice kind of, like, Transporter 2 is like a good, like, Sunday movie, if you need to watch like a Sunday action movie. So as always, everyone, thanks for listening. If you like this episode, make sure you like, subscribe, that you comment below. You can listen to all our episodes on wherever you listen to podcasts, or on all streaming platforms. And then you can also watch these full episodes with video on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel, press the notifications button for updates on new episodes. Special shout out to Neely for doing our intro and our outro song, as always. And outside of that, I don't know. You got anything else to add, Drew?
I drive. Because that's a quote from the movie Drive, which is like very similar to this, so you could put that GIF over it.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye, 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 bye.